The People's Temple began in the heart of the Midwest. In 1955, a young preacher named Jim Jones founded the group in Indianapolis, blending Christian revivalism with radical calls for racial integration and economic justice. At a time when segregation remained law and practice, Jones's church stood out. Black and white congregants worshiped together, sharing meals and housing support. By the early 1960s, Jones had built a reputation as a rising religious leader with a progressive message. But Jones was never satisfied with local success. He sought influence, both political and spiritual. Moving his base to California in the late 1960s, he tapped into the era's turbulence. Civil rights struggles, anti war protests, and disillusionment with mainstream institutions. In cities like Redwood Valley, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, the People's Temple expanded rapidly. By the early 1970s, membership reached into the thousands. Temple run programs included drug rehabilitation, free clinics, housing initiatives, and communal dining halls. Politicians welcomed Jones's grassroots support. In San Francisco, he gained allies among Democratic power brokers, and in 1976, he was appointed to the city's Housing Authority Commission. For followers, Jones offered not just religion, but a cause, a chance to build a multiracial, socialist utopia. Behind the image of progress, however, cracks began to form. Former members began speaking out. They described physical abuse, coerced confessions, and financial exploitation. Members were pressured to sign over paychecks, property, even custody of children. As early as 1972, newspapers began receiving complaints from concerned families. By 1977, New West magazine published a bombshell expose with ex members detailing beatings, staged healings, and psychological control. The piece made national headlines and marked the beginning of Jones's unraveling. Federal agencies also began circling. The IRS questioned the temple's nonprofit status and finances. The FBI opened files on Jones, concerned with reports of stockpiling weapons and paramilitary style drills. Local prosecutors weighed potential charges of fraud and abuse. Jones, once the darling of liberal politics, now saw enemies everywhere. Jones's personal struggles fueled the crisis. By the mid 1970s, he was increasingly dependent on barbiturates and amphetamines, sometimes slurring through sermons, other times ranting late into the night. He told followers that the government was plotting their destruction, that concentration camps awaited Black members, that fascism was rising in America. In his mind, the temple was not just a church, but a revolutionary movement under siege. The temple's inner circle reinforced this worldview. Dissenters were silenced, sometimes through public catharsis sessions, ritualized beatings or humiliations designed to keep members obedient. Those who attempted to leave were threatened with exposure of private confessions or lawsuits claiming child custody. The temple had become, in effect, a closed system, suspicious of outsiders, intolerant of criticism. By 1973, the question within Jones's leadership was no longer if they would leave the United States, but when. Relocation offered escape from legal scrutiny, but also the chance to build the utopia Jones had long promised, a self-sufficient community, free from capitalist exploitation and racial prejudice. Jones himself had already tested the idea. In the early 1960s, he spent 2 years in Brazil, supposedly on a missionary trip, but in reality studying survival strategies for a potential communal settlement. He also visited British Guiana, noting its tropical climate and abundance of undeveloped land. By the mid 1970s, the People's Temple actively scouted relocation sites across the globe. Each was weighed against the same fears. How secure would they be from U.S. interference? How isolated from media exposure? How welcoming would the host government be to a group of American expatriates led by a controversial preacher. The crisis came to a head in 1977. Amid mounting press investigations, Jones abruptly moved hundreds of followers from California to Guyana, claiming it was the only place they could live free. Families left behind were devastated, some organizing into what became known as the Concerned Relatives Group, lobbying Congress to intervene. What drove Jones's decision was not just ideology, but survival. In America, scrutiny was closing in. In Guyana, he saw a chance to rule without oversight. The People's Temple had gone from a Midwestern church championing racial justice to a California powerhouse with political ties to an embattled sect seeking refuge abroad. The journey from Indianapolis to Jonestown began not in the jungle, but in the mounting paranoia and collapse of trust that defined their final years in the United States. Jones began speaking of nuclear war and racial apocalypse. He told followers that survival depended on finding a remote place, far from the reach of American politics and potential catastrophe. In 1962, Jones relocated with his family to Brazil, settling first in Belo Horizonte and later in Rio de Janeiro. Publicly, he described it as missionary work. Privately, it was reconnaissance. He studied language, culture, and survival strategies. But Brazil posed challenges. Jones struggled with Portuguese, the family lived modestly, and political instability made the country less appealing as a long-term refuge. After 2 years, he returned to Indiana, but the idea of escape had taken root. During this same period, Jones briefly visited British Guiana, then still a British colony. He noted the tropical climate, fertile land, and the government's openness to foreign settlers. Though nothing concrete came of the visit, it planted a seed. Years later, when Guyana gained independence and leaned toward socialism, the memory of that trip resurfaced. For Jones, the country seemed promising, English speaking, politically aligned with his ideals, and far from U.S. oversight. By the early 1970s, the temple's leadership took the search more seriously. As accusations of abuse and financial misconduct grew, Jones directed aides to research relocation sites. Teams studied climate reports, agricultural potential, and immigration laws. Several candidates emerged: Grenada, newly independent and experimenting with socialist policies. Its proximity to the U.S. was appealing, but its small size made secrecy difficult. Jones feared American influence would remain strong. Trinidad and Bermuda, both English-speaking and relatively stable, but again, both were too exposed, tourist destinations with strong Western ties. Jones concluded that hostile journalists or U.S. authorities could easily reach them. Peru, with vast agricultural land and a history of leftist movements, Peru seemed viable. But its ongoing political unrest, including violent insurgencies, made settlement risky. Kenya. In Africa, Kenya attracted attention because of its post-colonial government and opportunities for farming. Yet cultural and language barriers, along with distance, created too many uncertainties for an American sect seeking rapid relocation. Brazil. Despite Jones's earlier stay, Brazil was revisited as an option. But its political volatility in the 1970s, marked by military dictatorship, made it dangerous for a large, high-profile group. Each possibility came with logistical or political hurdles. Again and again, locations were studied, then ruled out. The urgency of relocation increased dramatically in 1977. Following New West magazine's expose, Jones became convinced that U.S. authorities were preparing a crackdown. He warned followers that concentration camps awaited them, that children would be seized, that the temple's dream would be destroyed. In this atmosphere of paranoia, the search for a safe haven turned from theory into action. Guyana rose to the top of the list. The government under Prime Minister Forbes Burnham promoted cooperative farming and socialism, ideals that echoed the temple's rhetoric. Its remote northwest interior promised isolation, and most importantly, it was English speaking, no language barrier for hundreds of incoming Americans. Jones told followers that in Guyana, they would finally be free, free from racist America, free from hostile reporters, free from government harassment. It would be, in his words, a promised land. But the decision carried profound consequences. The isolation that promised safety would soon turn into entrapment. The distance that kept U.S. authorities at bay would also make it harder for members to leave. And the government that welcomed the temple would eventually face the global fallout of Jonestown's collapse. In the mid 1970s, Guyana was still a young nation, only a decade removed from British colonial rule. Prime Minister Forbes Burnham led the country under the banner of cooperative socialism. His administration promoted racial unity between Afro and Indo-Guyanese citizens, nationalized industries, and emphasized agricultural self-sufficiency. Guyana's economy, however, faced challenges. Development projects required outside investment, and Burnham sought ways to attract foreign partners who aligned with his socialist ideals. When representatives of the People's Temple approached, promising to bring skilled labor, agricultural development, and international goodwill, Guyanese officials were receptive. To Burnham, this was more than an investment, it was a symbolic partnership. Hosting a racially integrated American church dedicated to communal farming could strengthen Guyana's global image as a leader of the non-aligned movement, distancing itself from both U.S. capitalism and Soviet communism. Behind the scenes, temple leaders prepared detailed proposals. They framed the settlement as an agricultural mission that would help Guyana feed its people and modernize farming in the interior. The temple's multiracial composition was emphasized, aligning neatly with Burnham's vision of a unified society. Guyana's Ministry of Information and Agriculture took interest. Temple members had already visited the country in the early 1970s, scouting land and meeting officials. By 1976, Jones's emissaries were negotiating directly with government ministers. Their message was clear: the People's Temple would bring resources, skilled labor, and international attention to Guyana's socialist experiment. In 1976, the deal was struck. The People's Temple was granted a lease of nearly 3,900 acres in the Barima-Waini district, a remote area in the country's northwest near the Venezuelan border. The terms were favorable, just 25 cents per acre, with minimal restrictions on development. The location itself was key. Accessible only by boat and plane, it was hours away from Georgetown, cut off from regular oversight. For Guyana, it was an underdeveloped frontier that needed settlement. For Jones, it was isolation, a buffer from journalists, U.S. investigators, and defectors. Temple members began clearing jungle, constructing dormitories, kitchens, and agricultural plots. They named the settlement Jonestown after their leader. Early reports presented it as a model cooperative farm with smiling workers, healthy crops, and children attending school. Guyanese officials praised the project publicly, framing it as proof of the nation's socialist promise. The partnership seemed mutually beneficial. Guyana gained international recognition for hosting the settlement. Jones gained legitimacy, backed by the imprimatur of a sovereign state. But beneath the surface, motivations diverged. For Burnham, the temple was a useful ally, but far from central to his political strategy. For Jones, Guyana was everything: the final refuge for his followers, the last stand for his vision of a socialist utopia. Jones insisted on secrecy and control. Temple members were instructed to present Jonestown as a paradise in letters home, even as living conditions grew harsher. Guyanese officials, distant from the site and occupied with national politics, took the reports at face value. They did not see, or chose not to see, the signs of authoritarian control that were already taking hold. Without oversight, Jones had unchecked authority. Without easy access, members had little chance of escape. And without accountability, Guyana's government remained largely blind to the reality of life inside Jonestown until it was too late. The site of Jonestown lay deep in Guyana's northwest, accessible only by a long boat ride or small plane. The first advance team of temple members arrived in 1974 to begin clearing the land. They hacked through dense vegetation, built rudimentary shelters, and experimented with crops suited to the tropical climate. By 1977, hundreds of followers began arriving in waves from California, often under pressure from Jones to abandon their homes, jobs, and families. For many, the journey was framed as a pilgrimage to safety, a chance to live free from racism, poverty, and oppression in the United States. But the reality of Jonestown was harsh. Supplies were scarce, and the jungle resisted cultivation. Despite claims of self sufficiency, the community relied heavily on imported goods from Georgetown. The soil was poor, crops often failed, and labor was grueling. Members worked long hours in the fields, under the sweltering heat, battling mosquitoes and tropical disease. Jonestown's daily routine was rigid and exhausting. Members rose early to farm, build, and maintain the compound. Meals were simple: rice, beans, cassava, and often insufficient. In the evenings, residents attended mandatory meetings where Jones delivered long speeches, blending scripture with political ideology. Entertainment and information were tightly controlled. Loudspeakers broadcast Jones's voice day and night, playing recorded sermons or news reports selected to reinforce his message that the outside world was collapsing and only Jonestown offered salvation. Letters home were censored. Visits from family or outsiders were rare and closely supervised. Members were discouraged or outright forbidden from leaving the settlement. The remoteness that had once promised safety now served as a tool of containment. Governance in Jonestown was centralized entirely in Jim Jones. His inner circle, known as the Planning Commission, enforced rules and meted out discipline. Members who defied orders were subjected to public humiliation or forced labor. Some endured physical punishment. Jones cultivated loyalty through a mixture of fear and devotion. He staged loyalty tests, including rehearsals for mass suicide known as White Nights. Members were told to drink what they believed was poison, only to discover afterward it was harmless. The exercises reinforced obedience and created an atmosphere where resistance seemed futile. Jones's health and paranoia worsened. Addicted to barbiturates, he often ranted incoherently over the loudspeakers, warning of CIA plots, fascist conspiracies, and imminent invasion. His followers, isolated from external perspectives, had little choice but to accept his narrative. Publicly, Jonestown was portrayed as a thriving success. When Guyanese officials or foreign visitors toured the settlement, they were shown tidy housing, school lessons, and cultural performances. Children sang songs praising socialism and racial harmony. Smiling members spoke of unity and progress. But beneath the facade, disillusionment grew. Some residents attempted escape, risking the jungle and river patrols to reach Georgetown. Others confided secretly in visiting relatives about mistreatment. The Concerned Relatives group in the U.S. continued lobbying Congress, warning that Jonestown was not the paradise Jones claimed, but a prison camp. Still, to the outside world, Jonestown remained largely hidden. Its remoteness insulated it from scrutiny, while Jones's influence over his flock tightened. By 1978, the settlement's population swelled to over 900, making it one of the largest expatriate communities in Guyana. The foundations of disaster were already in place. The same isolation that gave Jones control also trapped his followers. The same political alignment that won him favor with Guyana's government also reduced oversight, and the same devotion that drew members to the jungle left them vulnerable to Jones's final command. Jonestown had been built as a refuge, a sanctuary from the pressures of American society. Instead, it became a closed system, one where dissent was punished, reality was distorted, and escape was nearly impossible. The stage was set for the events of November 18th, 1978, when Congressman Leo Ryan's fact finding mission would trigger the deadliest outcome imaginable.
Have been raised about your operation here, but I can tell you right now that from the few conversations I've had with some of the folks here already this evening, that whatever the comments are, there are some people here who believe that this is the best thing that ever happened to them in their whole life.
On November 18, 1978, Jonestown collapsed into tragedy. More than 900 people died in what remains one of the largest mass deaths in modern history. For Guyana, a small nation of fewer than 1 million citizens at the time, the scale of the disaster was staggering. The country had invited the People's Temple as partners in development. Instead, it became the unwilling stage for one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. In the hours following the mass deaths, Guyanese officials were overwhelmed. Police, soldiers, and medical teams were dispatched to the remote settlement, but the scale of the scene defied comprehension. The jungle clearing was filled with bodies, most lying near the pavilion where Jim Jones had delivered his final sermon. Children, women, men, all sprawled across the earth, cups of poisoned drink beside them. Prime Minister Forbes Burnham's government immediately launched an inquest. Guyanese officials sought to determine whether the deaths had been voluntary, coerced, or ordered by Jones. Surviving temple members were detained and questioned in Georgetown. Reports compiled by Guyanese investigators became part of the historical record, documenting both the scale of the deaths and the final hours of Jonestown. The Guyanese government faced intense international scrutiny. The United States sent military aircraft to recover bodies, eventually flying more than 900 coffins back to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. The presence of American troops in Guyana raised uncomfortable questions about sovereignty. Some Guyanese citizens criticized the government for allowing Jones such autonomy. Others saw the tragedy as an American problem that had spilled into their territory. For Burnham's government, Jonestown was an embarrassment. Officials insisted they had been misled by the temple's promises of agricultural development and social harmony. They argued that no one could have foreseen the scale of the disaster. Still, the incident cast a long shadow over Guyana's international reputation. Diplomats were forced to answer tough questions about why a foreign sect had been allowed to establish such a large settlement with so little oversight. At home, political opponents accused the Burnham administration of negligence, even complicity. The government's close relationship with Jones, who had donated money and cultivated ties with Guyanese elites, came under scrutiny. In time, Jonestown became a political taboo. For many years, Guyanese officials avoided discussing the tragedy, regarding it as an unwelcome stain on the nation's history. After the tragedy, Jonestown was abandoned. The jungle quickly began reclaiming the land. Buildings decayed, crops rotted, and the once bustling commune fell silent. Local villagers occasionally ventured into the ruins, salvaging wood, tools, and other materials. By the mid 1980s, little remained beyond foundations and overgrowth. For survivors and relatives, the site became a place of mourning, though few visited. The memory of Jonestown was carried more in headlines, documentaries, and courtroom testimonies than in pilgrimages to the ground itself. Yet the land lease remained on record. Technically, the property reverted back to the Guyanese state, but its dark legacy ensured that no major development followed. Jonestown became a ghost of history, present on maps, absent in daily life. In recent years, Guyana has cautiously reopened the conversation. Some officials have suggested developing the site as a memorial or even a tourist attraction, hoping to transform tragedy into heritage. Supporters argue it could provide education, generate revenue, and honor the victims. Critics warn it risks sensationalizing mass death or exploiting trauma. The debate reflects larger tensions about how societies remember dark history. For Guyana, Jonestown is both foreign and domestic, an American sect's tragedy that unfolded on Guyanese soil. Internationally, Jonestown continues to haunt public imagination. The very name has become shorthand for blind obedience and mass death. But for survivors, scholars, and families, the focus remains on understanding how ordinary people, motivated by ideals of racial equality and justice, became trapped in a closed world that ended in catastrophe. Jonestown was meant to be a sanctuary. For Jim Jones, it was a stage to garner increasing power. For Guyana, it was a promise of development. For the followers, it was hope for a better life. Instead, it became a mass grave. It remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history. What do you think? Did Jonestown's location contribute to the tragedy that unfolded, or was it inevitable no matter where they went? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to help more people discover the hidden files of Caribbean history.